100 years, Hydro One has been one of the main transmission and distributors of electricity for all of Canada. The majority of the electricity has been provided to the province of Ontario, which holds around 38% of Canada's population. Out of that 38%, 78% of the people in Ontario use this service. However, over the years, consumers of the Hydro One monopoly have seen a drastic increase in price.
There are several factors that contribute to the increase in prices. However, we believe that when the government decided to privatize in 2015, things started to change. Thus, we believe Hydro One should be intensely monitored and regulated by the government to ensure fair prices and reliable service for the customers. By having the government make decisions for its own people, more conscious decisions will be made when it comes to prices, rather than having the private shareholders make the decisions based on their own earning. The sole purpose of the regulation should be to lower the cost, to match those of the neighboring provinces, and to further the technological advances to promote more economic growth in future years. The interests of political parties should not influence the decisions made and regulations implemented in Ontario's electricity market. So this brings up the question, should governments impose restrictions and regulations on the markets? And if they should, why should they, or why shouldn't they? So governments should impose restrictions and regulations on the electricity market, because getting electricity into homes and business involves a series of separate activities. Power is generated through a number of sources, such as hydro dams, nuclear power plants, and wind and solar energy. Once the power is generated, it must be fed into a network of transmission lines that distribute the energy to the end users. This is part of the process, the transmission and distribution of electricity. It's a natural monopoly. It requires a massive capital to build the transmission lines and a complex system to feed the power throughout the province. Left to an unregulated market, there would be significant economic disincentives for companies to serve small or remote communities. Ontario has many of these small and remote communities, and providers would have very little economic reason to try and service those areas with complex and expensive power transmission and distribution systems. Also, a power system without regulatory oversight could discriminate against customers. Without regulation, a customer who couldn't pay for their power could be cut off in the middle of the winter, leaving them at risk of serious physical discomfort and injury. And this is why electricity's transmission and distribution is a natural monopoly. Unless one group builds and operates the entire system, the inefficiencies in the system would leave people stranded and in the dark. Just because something operates best as a natural monopoly doesn't mean that the government itself should be the choice to operate the monopoly. Until 2015, Hydro One was completely owned by the government of Ontario and operated across Ontario. The Liberal government decided that it should privatize Hydro One monopoly. They did this by selling shares of Hydro One on the TSX. Hydro One is still a monopoly. No other company is permitted by law to transmit or distribute power in the competition with Hydro One. However, the shareholders of Hydro One are now public, with Government of Ontario holding 49.9% of the shares of Hydro One. Hydro One has 1.3 million customers, and Hydro One's service territory covers about 75% of Ontario, and Hydro One has been generating power in Ontario for over 110 years. Ontario has the highest rates for electricity in Canada. By comparison, Quebecers pay about half what Ontarians do for electricity. This price disparity reflects a long history of government mishandling and the way in which power in Ontario is managed. The reality is that electricity is an essential service, but different political parties have changed policies over the past several decades, causing a lot of uncertainty. Without an overall long-term strategy about how best to regulate and restrict the electricity market, short-term policies get implemented. Governments have to appeal to voters to stay in power, and therefore tend to focus on short-term issues rather than long-term planning. Since Hydro One went public on the TSX in November of 2015, the company had to begin to make decisions based on the interest of shareholders. The company's new goal is to maximize profits and to keep shareholders happy and to keep the company afloat. Electricity prices in Ontario are already the highest in Canada, which leaves very little room for Hydro One to increase their prices for any reasons, especially for the interests of shareholders. The government should have price ceilings on essential services, which includes hydro. People should not be forced to pay unreasonable prices for an essential service. However, governments are not the best regulators for the long term, as many Ontarians know, facing the highest electricity prices in the country. The solution is not to deregulate the industry, but to have long-term and stable regulations that the political process cannot derail with short-term changes that are driven by the desire to get votes.
So now that Tom has explained to you the effects of privatization, I'm going to talk to you about what really happens when a company becomes privatized. When the government decided to privatize Hydro One, this meant that they would be giving up being a crown corporation. Ultimately, they would end up selling small shares to private investors. And then when Kathleen Wynne started the privatization move in 2015, she wanted about 60% of Hydro One to be privately owned. So currently, as Thomas said, the government owns about 49% of Hydro One, while the rest is owned by private investors. So what does this mean for consumers of the monopoly? Well, firstly, when the government sold shares, they added on contracts. These contracts ensure that the private sector would be responsible for cost overruns and other construction problems in exchange for 20-year contracts from the government. However, these contracts stated that the companies would obtain a certain amount of revenue no matter how much electricity was used. This is where one of the problem lies. During 2016 to 2017, the demand for electricity was not at its highest, and even at its peaks, there was a surplus of electricity. This meant that there was extra electricity being generated. This meant that due to the contracts being part of the privatized sector, the people of Ontario had to pay for the surplus whether they wanted to or not, thus prices going up. Privatizing the company would also bring competition with it. This can be good for an economy, but what ended up happening is that the private investor would want to increase prices to increase their own revenue. Another concern that privatization brings is the service to the customers. Previously, being a crown corporation, all eyes were on the government when things went well or when things didn't go well. This meant that the company had a standard to perform by to ensure that all people would think goodly or would think highly of the government. Lastly, having Hydro One being privatized increased the lack of oversight. Before, if there was a problem with the service of Hydro One, the people would go to the government and complain directly to them. Nowadays, because the government only has a certain percent of the company, they can only influence a good amount of decisions, but they can't make the final call. Each of these reasons support why we believe that Hydro One should not be a privatized corporation and why it should be regulated fairly heavily by the government. So what are the benefits of having Hydro One as a monopoly with full government or very high government regulation? Well, firstly, decisions by the government will be more focused on the actual consumer and the people of Ontario and their demands. As I said before, the government will perform at a standard to satisfy their people. Doing this will increase the amount of consumers that will use the service, and this will keep fixed costs low. This is good for the business as the rates of electricity will start to go down. This is where the government should start to think about the future of its country's economy. Over the 21st century, technology has seen a huge increase in many fields of business, manufacturing being one of the biggest. However, manufacturing and technology requires a lot of electricity, but with high electricity rates, manufacturing businesses have decided to move out of the province to somewhere else where there are cheaper rates for electricity. This can be detrimental toward the Canadian economy, as manufacturing plants provide a lot of money, jobs, and overall economic growth. Thus, in order to ensure the progress of the success of the Canadian economy, the government should impose restrictions on the Hydro One business to not only ensure low prices for all consumers, which improves the standard of living, but also to have the economy well set for the future, so that manufacturing corporations or any other businesses can come together and start off knowing that they have a fair rate for their electricity. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Now, remember, we gave you the power of knowledge, just like Hydro One gives us the power